The more that I started reading through it, the less, I guess, health became an enigma, and the more that it started looking like this beautiful painting where all these things work together so beautifully. And that as long as you actually nourish your body as you should, things tend to function as they should. And it's not all about restriction and just cutting things out. The more energy that we can generate, the faster we can regenerate, the better we can regenerate, the more our body can kind of stay structurally coherent and functional. You look at different disease states, and like that's the unifying principle, is that there's an energy failure in every disease state.
The single most important question in all of health might very well be, how well is your body turning food into fuel? This is the central question for any living organism, the basis for all biology. Alzheimer's, arthritis, long COVID and post-viral issues, thyroid, Hashimoto's, insulin resistance, iron deficiency, iron toxicity, autoimmunity. All these and most every other health concern you can think of, perhaps only exempting fully genetic issues, which themselves are often metabolic inhibitors, are downstream of metabolic function, which is determined by how efficiently your cells turn the primary fuel substrates you consume, carbs, fats, and protein, into the energy your body requires to carry out every single function demanded of it. We need adequate cellular energy to have well-functioning detoxification, to fully rest and sleep deeply, to structure water inside our bodies, etc., etc., etc. The list is endless. When we have adequate cellular energy, things tend to take care of themselves. When we don't, we can spend our precious time and energy chasing symptom after symptom, not realizing that improving cellular metabolism is the one intervention to rule them all. My guest today is Kaya, an independent health researcher with a brilliant mind capable of simplifying complex information. I think of her Substack articles as an intermediary between the deep dive, time-consuming research of primary sources that I am never going to do myself, and a public grappling with complex health issues that often feel impossible to understand, let alone heal. She spends her time reading studies and writing long-form articles explaining common health concerns and giving step-by-step ways to overcome them, all through the lens of metabolic health. Her Substack is called Fundamental Nourishment and is one of the best investments I have made in my health. I've wanted to have her on for a long time, so this is an exciting moment for me. The viewpoint we're discussing here is often called pro-metabolic, but that word has been essentially rendered meaningless by the endless stream of poorly informed online content that sometimes leaves people worse off instead of better. Since I find this framework, also called bioenergetic, so coherent as a philosophy and so helpful in my actual life, and therefore find the confused and confusing online discourse so vexing, Kaya and I have recorded a Patreon bonus all about what pro-metabolic influencers get wrong. It's a lot. We talk about the actual origins of pro-metabolic versus other ideologies that influencers have braided into it. For example, Weston A. Price, whose high-fat recommendations have created a slew of problems that we're now seeing a backlash against. The basics of Dr. Ray Peat's work versus how it gets misinterpreted online. Why going pro-metabolic caused weight gain and other health issues for those of us who dove in a few years ago when it went crazy online. And we talk about the food categories that Kaya feels are best when starting your nourishment journey, with a focus on high micronutrient foods, especially for people who don't want to track, but know they need some help in the food department. What pulled so many of us into pro-metabolic was the promise of nourishment. This is something that women deeply crave. As I saw with the reaction to my interview with Ashley Wolkin a couple episodes ago, the epidemic of women undernourishing, such a big reaction to that. Women just really feel this. We feel this deep crave to nourish ourselves, and we want to provide that for our loved ones as well. Years or decades of restriction, food fear, and stress have left so many of us depleted, dealing with chronic health issues, and determined to feed ourselves better. So I have such a heart for this because this is my story through and through, as I talk about in that episode with Ashley. And like Kaya, I am wary of contributing more noise to the online discourse around food and health. But like Kaya, I have seen and experienced firsthand that once we center metabolism and our own bio-individual needs, the downstream effects can be profound. There is no such thing as the quote pro-metabolic diet that influencers would have you following. So we go more into all of that at patreon.com/medicine stories. This podcast is entirely listener supported on Patreon, just as Kaya's work is reader supported on Substack. We're in a bit of a Wild West moment, both in the kind of content being created online and in the reality of sustaining it. There's a spectrum from thoughtful, nuanced work that's willing to evolve, which is why I'm so drawn to Kaya's work, and to content driven by clicks, money, or prestige. And there's also the question of how to keep meaningful work alive by asking those who value it to support it. Kaya and I are deeply grateful to those of you who recognize that and who help make it possible for us to keep creating for real people and not the algorithm. So without further ado, thank you so much, Kaya, for joining me to have this long overdue conversation. And I hope it helps to provide clarity on this framework for those of you listening who might be struggling with your own nourishment and low energy and chronic health issues. It's been really helpful for me. Okay, hi, Kaya. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to meet you, see your face for the first time. I've been reading your Substack for years and have really just consumed a lot of what you've put out. And I'm so grateful for your super deep dives into metabolic health. And I realized this morning that I don't know much about you. I don't know your background. So if you could begin by telling us, please, how you came to be doing what you're doing.
Yeah, of course. So first of all, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. And of course, I appreciate your support as well and reading my work. So a little bit about me. I have a Substack where I write about metabolism, health, how it all kind of ties together, how I came upon this work. It's kind of, I guess I was kind of thrown into it by being born in the first place. I had quite a few health concerns as a child, and they were always like a bit of an enigma. And it was always things just kind of layering onto one another, and none of it really made much sense. So that naturally sent me down the path of doing all the different health things. First, the health things which I thought were healthy, which they weren't, which was just a lot of exercise, a lot of restricting, and, trying to, or thinking that lack of discipline was why, let's say, I was chubby as a kid and things like that. That backfired, as it tends to do. And that sent me down the path of trying to figure out, like, okay, what am I maybe missing? So I went through the paleo. Eventually, that backfired on me with gut health kind of deteriorating on that, just losing my menstrual cycle. I think a lot of women have a similar experience. Unfortunately, that sent me down an even darker path, let's say, where I went keto carnivore. So I dabbled in that for some time until I realized that what I'm reading that should be happening is not happening. Like, my blood sugar is not getting lower, it's going higher on keto carnivore. My body composition is not getting better, but I'm gaining fat. And I don't have more energy, I have less energy, and now my stress tolerance is in the toilet. So I basically have to admit, like, okay, this isn't working, but I feel like I've kind of hit the wall with all the recommendations that I've seen. Like, I'm restricting as much as you can, right? Like zero carb. I mean, how much more can you go? And then I stumbled onto the work of Dr. Ray Peat. And his work on metabolism and hormones. And at first, I was apprehensive to touch it, just because I think some of the first works that I stumbled upon were talking about, well, the benefits of carbohydrates and how maybe actually a higher carbohydrate, lower fat diet can be helpful. I think one of his first articles I stumbled upon was where he was actually talking about sugar for diabetes. So of course, coming from like this low carb community to stumble upon an article that's actually talking about how there are cases of curing diabetes with sugar, I was like, I'm not reading all that. But then I read all that and I went through the references and I started reading the studies. And at first, of course, I had like so much resistance, like, old studies, no. And then the more I started reading into it, I was like, okay, I think he has a point. I see that he has a point even from my own experiencing what's happening to my body. So I went down that whole, I basically became obsessed with his work, but also reading the references through the papers that he put out, getting my hands on books that he referenced in his work, and kind of just the more that I started reading through it, the less, I guess, health became an enigma, and the more that it started looking like this beautiful painting where all these things work together so beautifully. And that as long as you actually nourish your body as you should, things tend to function as they should. And it's not all about restriction and just cutting things out. And that sent me down a path of really becoming like obsessed with trying to understand it, trying to kind of uncover the deeper layers of the onion. So about 4 years ago, I basically left my previous job, which was not related to health. And I started pursuing this, I would say, professionally, researching full-time, writing my findings and just kind of what I'm learning. So that's how the Substack came about. I was excited about what I was learning. I was excited about the work that I was finding, and I wanted to share it, especially because something that I struggled with in the past when I was still doing paleo, when I was still doing carnivore, was that there was a lack of good information. There was a lack of people asking why. It was a lot of like, you need to do this, you need to do that. But then when you actually try to dig into it, understand like, why is this supposed to work? Or like, what is the mechanism through which this is supposed to work? It was kind of just like a big, I don't know, like the information was just not there, or certain things were paradoxical. And then when you try to ask, well, why is it that way? You'd either get an answer like, I don't know, it just is, or like that just wouldn't be there. So basically, I wanted to put out into the world what I was missing when I was going through all these struggles and all this confusion, something that actually peels back all of the layers of the onion and tries to explain it in a way so that it finally makes sense. So that is kind of how I eventually stumbled upon this work. So my own experiences, and then eventually getting really passionate about it and wanting to create resources that I wish I would have had 10 years ago or so.
Yes, that is exactly what your work is for me. And I'm so grateful for it, because to me, and we can get into this right next, but like Dr. Ray Peat's work and the quote metabolic or bioenergetic framework of going to cellular metabolism first and the energy production system in the body, it's as upstream as it gets. So I get that framework immediately and it makes sense. But then there's this whole spectrum in between, like the original research and then what influencers have made it on Instagram that often makes things worse for people. And I was like, I'm not probably going to read Dr. Peat's work myself.
Yeah.
But I get the framework and it makes the most sense for me and it's helped me the most. But I still want to have answers to my questions. But where do I even find them? There's all these articles and books. And then this is where your Substack, Fundamental Nourishment, has come in for me, that you deep dive. Heavily annotated. you cite your sources, and there are many sources. Some of your articles take 2 hours to read, some are less, but this is like for the person who actually wants to understand. I'm someone who has to understand in order to make things.
I'm the same way.
Yes, I have to know the why. Yeah, because you're right. Like my keto, we have a really similar background, and doing keto and all these things, I was just like, okay, this guy says to do it, and like his. Now I see faulty reasoning made sense to me at the time. Now I know that like you have to keep going with your questions within a framework. Like, I don't know, it's hard to describe, but I've just refined my ability to like think rationally about health over the years. And your work has really helped with that. So I thought, and I've really touched on this stuff lightly on this podcast over the years. A lot of my listeners will know my health journey, and but okay, actually, I have a good way to frame this. Brian Johnson, right? The guy.
Yes, the guy.
The vampire whose skin is so pale. His approach, right, is like he is happy that his body temperature is low. He brags about how low his body temperature is because he buys into the rate of living theory. And I thought we could start by contrasting that idea of like the less calories, the lower the body temperature, the longer you'll live, with the reality of what it takes to actually fuel and nourish a body.
Yeah, 100%. So it's funny because this idea that if you drop your body temperature, you're going to live longer, that's been around for such a long time. And I feel like even in like pop culture, it's been around for a while. Like I touched on my childhood a little bit. but like when I was a kid, now that I know, I was very hypothyroid, probably born hypothyroid, and my body temperature was always like 35 Celsius, which is like 95 Fahrenheit, super low. And I remember like at one point someone said to me, it's like, oh, your body temperature is so low, you're going to live so long. And in my head, I was like, I don't even know if I'm going to live to see Thursday with how shit I feel. So like that already was kind of starting to feel to me a little bit like, are we sure that this is actually good for us? But with the rate of living theory, so yes, Brian Johnson subscribes to this theory, which I guess the gist of it is that the slower you live, the longer you live. That if you lower your metabolic rate, that if you lower your body temperature, you're going to somehow last longer. And how that idea came about, if I remember correctly, I think it came about in the early 1900s, around the time of the Industrial Revolution, where we were very excited about machines and how they work. And it was kind of looking first at the logic of machines, that if you have a car, if you drive it less, it's going to last longer because the turbines are not going to wear out and so on. And then it started with some animal research, looking at certain animals that, let's say, have pretty high metabolic rate, let's say like mice, that they live only a few years, and then comparing them to a couple of other species, like let's say tortoises, which have a relatively lower metabolic rate, but then they live a very long time. And really the research only looked at a certain amount of very cherry-picked data on animals. And like the graph that shows the rate of living theory is very funny because it's basically just like a straight line. And it's trying to show that like the lower your metabolic rate, the longer you're going to live. It's like super simplistic. And then the initial research that kind of also really sprung this idea into existence was done on fruit flies, where basically they were like put into suspended animation, like a hibernation state for a while through like very cold temperatures, and seeing that the ones that were kind of put in this suspended animation, then they lived longer. But I mean, if we actually look deeper at what happened to them, like their ovaries shut down, like they went into like complete like non-functional state. But now, does this actually make sense? And does it translate to humans? So the interesting thing about these, I guess, cherry-picked animals was that if we actually looked within the species, like if we looked at specifically mice, the mice that actually had like a genetic mutation that made their metabolism like unusually high, they lived about 20% longer than other mice. So I think it was similar with hamsters, the ones that had a higher metabolic rate within the species lived like 36% longer. So once we started looking within the species, we started seeing like, okay, does it really make sense to compare mice to turtles and to fruit flies? Because when we actually look within the species, we're not seeing that. And then it didn't also translate to other species. Like if we look at parrots, for example, they are hypermetabolic. Their heart rate is like 120, and they live up to like 60, 70 years. So anyway, eventually, like nowadays, the research is kind of admitting that like, yeah, that didn't really make sense. And now we're learning more about the body. Now we have these other theories that are kind of like, oh, maybe it's the oxidative stress. So like how much damage you accumulate that actually kills you over time. Maybe it's other things. However, in a lot of like the influencer space or the longevity space, this idea that the lower your metabolism, the longer you're going to live, because the assumption is that you have like a limited amount of heartbeats, and that like the slower your heart beats, the longer that like bucket of heartbeats is going to last you, which it's kind of, I mean, to me at this point, with what I know, it sounds very silly when I say it out loud, but that is still like what kind of permeates the space. So a lot of things like fasting, caloric restriction, dropping your body temperature is all about lowering metabolic rate, thinking that like you live slow, you live long, you live fast, you die young. So now, I guess if we actually look at like would that mechanistically make sense, the interesting thing is that it actually doesn't really make sense in living beings. So, and I know I'm getting a little bit mechanistic, so I hope it's okay. But there was this research looking at heartbeats, like what happens when you stop the heart for a bit, and this was done in animals too. And the assumption was that if you stop the heart, you're going to let it rest for a little bit so that when you stimulate it to start up again, it's going to start beating harder when it starts up because it had the time to rest. What they found was the opposite. When you slow it down, then when it kicks back in, it's actually struggling. It's struggling, and the more it beats, eventually it starts beating better. And it's almost like in living organisms, energy is actually what helps you function, what regenerates you, what actually helps you keep going. So I think I have a quote here, and let me see if I have some notes for this podcast. So let me see if I can actually find it. But it was, yeah. So this was a quote from the book "The Living State" by Albert St. Georgi, and it was talking about this experiment, and it basically sums it up that function generates function, and motion generates motion, and that life generates life, which I think is just put so beautifully.
It's like energy begets energy, which is exactly what
exactly.
Yeah.
And then, like, what does it actually mean when we say energy? Because I think, like, if we look at more like, I guess, the spiritual space, there's a lot of talk about energy, and it's kind of like vibes, or maybe something more like esoteric and yeah, supernatural. But in the body, basically, when we think about food, we think about, oh, it's energy, it's calories. However, there's like a big like pipeline, you can think of it, that the food that we actually eat and that we digest has to go through in our actual cells to become energy, to become the thing that our cells actually feed on. So we feed on carbs, we feed on fats, our body digests it, and then our cells, eventually our mitochondria, take that up and they turn it into something that's called ATP. So ATP is basically like the battery pack that our cells run on. And they use that to repair themselves. They use that to power their functions. They use it to maintain themselves. So it's basically currency that pays for different things to get done in our body. Like if you are speaking, if you're talking to someone, that uses up ATP, that uses up energy. If you're learning something, that uses up ATP. If you cut your hand open and your body has to heal that, that takes up ATP. If you have an infection and your immune system has to basically get rid of that infection, that uses up ATP. And it's interesting when we actually start looking at this energy model, that if we look at any disease, like a degenerative disease, let's say something like Alzheimer's disease, you look at the brains of people with Alzheimer's and they have low rates of ATP in the brain. They are lacking the specific cofactors that you need to make ATP. So they might be lacking magnesium or vitamin B3 or vitamin B5. And all of these things are found to be low in the brains of people with Alzheimer's. Or they might have low levels of thyroid hormones, which that's a hormone that actually tells your body how fast to burn fuel and how fast to make ATP. Or they might have high levels of aluminum in the brain, which is something that is being discussed right now. But what aluminum does is that it basically displaces magnesium from ATP, and magnesium and ATP have to be like together to work. So at the end of the day, it all like boils down to this energy model, where in this function, you have these low levels of ATP, even in something like, if you look at a healthy joint versus the joint of someone with arthritis, the joints of people with arthritis have low levels of ATP. And when you have low levels of ATP, well, then you don't have the energy to repair that joint, to maintain that joint. And eventually it just starts degenerating, for lack of a better word. So if we start looking at it that way, we see that it's actually the opposite. The more energy that we can generate, the faster we can regenerate, the better we can regenerate, the more our body can kind of stay structurally coherent and functional. And it's actually once we start seeing this metabolic, downregulation, that diminished ability to make ATP, that slowing of metabolism, that diseases start to happen. So like the theory that a lot of, still influencers subscribe to is kind of very reductionist. It's very mechanistic. But when you start looking at it kind of like big picture and like piecing these things together, you start realizing that it's actually the opposite. And one last thing I'll also mention, because the reactive oxygen species theory is another one of aging, that reactive oxygen species are basically like this gunk that gets created when we make energy. Like there's always a little bit of like, let's say fumes, right? Like if you're, I don't know, running an engine, there's always a bit of fumes, and these fumes are, let's say, damaging. So the idea was that if your metabolism is faster, since these fumes are always a byproduct of metabolism, then you're going to generate more of them, you're going to degenerate quicker. And that still tries to play into that idea of the slower the metabolism, the better. However, what's interesting is that this ATP, this energy molecule, is actually used by our body to make antioxidants that mop up this cellular gunk. And that in some studies, it's actually the slower that your metabolism runs, the more chances there are for these kind of malfunctions to happen where you actually create more of the smoke, more of the fumes. So even that starts falling apart, because even our ability to clear the smoke, so to say, so that making energy doesn't injure the body, that still takes energy.
Before I realized that undernourishment was the problem beneath my problems, back when my nervous system was crying for carbs, but I thought I was just the most highly sensitive person on the planet, herbal medicine was my saving grace. I started off making remedies for myself and my loved ones, before eventually creating some of the first herbal offerings Etsy had ever seen. That feels like a lifetime ago now, but my tried and true formulas are still part of my family's daily life, and I still make them for women like me and you. When life asks everything of you, these plants offer something back. We create potent herbal medicines that transform ordinary moments into small ceremonies of self-care. Each remedy is crafted to support your nervous system, ease daily stress, and honor exactly where you are. Whether you're soothing a child's fever at midnight, stealing 5 minutes of quiet before dawn, banging your head against the steering wheel in traffic, or slipping into a hot bath before bed. No complicated routines, no adding to your mental load. Just simple, effective plant medicine that meets you in the midst of real life. Stash a bottle in your purse, in your center console, in your shower, by your bedside. Check out our offerings at mythicmedicine.shop. Yeah, I mean, to use the most simplistic metaphor that I can think of right now, like, when I was growing up, my dad was always like, turn a light off when you leave a room, because the light bulb will burn out the more it's used. So that's sort of this mechanical view that we're applying to the body, and it doesn't work because we are not machines in that way. We're living biological creatures. And my friend Susie always says a body in motion stays in motion.
Exactly.
So in that way, the longer the light bulb burns, the stronger its ability to burn gets, the healthier it is, the least likely it is to burn out, right? So I was just thinking when you were saying that when I was fasting a lot, which unfortunately I was doing in the late teens, not in my late teens, but in my late 30s, I was really into this idea that I kept reading that when you're not eating, when your body doesn't have to give all this energy to digestion, what it can do is direct all that energy to all the other things that need help within the body. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago when I started eating more and learning more about true nourishment that I realized, no, it's nourishing my body is what gives it the energy to do all those things that I thought it needed to do, the repair and all that kind of stuff. And so that was just a huge reframe for me, right? From going to restriction is the way to get healthy, to giving my body the fuel and micronutrients it needs is the way that it has enough energy to do all the things it needs to do, including repair functions.
Yeah, exactly. And even I think to play into that a bit of a different topic, but with fasting, there's also this idea of detox, right? You're not eating, that means that you're detoxing, but our detox organs, like the liver, the kidneys, they need so much energy just to function, to actually transform the toxins that our body comes into contact with, or even the toxins that get made in the body. They need not only fuel, but they also need so many vitamins and minerals just to even function. So it's the opposite. You need to give your body the resources that it uses to detox, as opposed to just giving it nothing and hoping for the best.
Yes. I'm just so glad everyone's talking about this, at least in my little world. I think about the irony too of as celebrity culture as Ozempic is taking hold, which is just starvation. That's what it is. At the same time, that's happening on the most extreme scale we've ever seen in the culture. I'm seeing more and more and more people talk about true nourishment. And I'm just glad that, those two poles are balancing each other out, or at least that the nourishment conversation is happening as we're witnessing this total insanity. So, okay, this is what I want my listeners to understand that I think you can help us get to is, so I think I was also born hypothyroid. I think I was also born to a hypothyroid mother. I wasn't diagnosed until I was 17. And I want to understand the interplay. I want to understand what thyroid is doing in the body, why we need carbs and sugar for proper thyroid function and proper metabolic function. Because I also, did keto, did like unconscious low carb for a long time. Just be like, I just won't eat the crust and I'll take, I'm not going to eat that rice. Yeah, let's just, I know that's a big question, but let's just dive in and see where we go.
Yeah, I think that starting with thyroid is really good because I think that a lot of people have some sort of a thyroid dysfunction without really realizing it because of tests, but also because of how we think about thyroid. So part of me also almost doesn't like using the word thyroid because then we just think about the gland. We think about the gland on our neck, but it's a systemic issue because, for example, so the thyroid hormone, so first what it does is that's the hormone that actually controls the rate at which your little engines in your body, your mitochondria, your cells make energy. So the thyroid hormone has to get into your cell and basically tell it like, okay, speed up. Like that's the hormone that basically says we have a good amount of fuel coming in. Let's speed up. Let's make more ATP so that you have the energy to repair and detox and do all these things that help your body stay alive. So it's basically a very important hormone. Like every single cell in the body relies on it. But then when we actually look at it more systemically, so first your thyroid gland, the one on your neck, it creates a few different hormones, but the main ones that we usually talk about are the T4 hormone thyroxine and the T3 active thyroid hormone. So the gland creates mostly the T4 hormone and then a tiny bit of T3. And then your other organs like the liver, a little bit the kidneys, even the gut, the heart, convert that T4 into the T3 active hormone. So we already run into one issue here, right? Somebody can have a perfectly functioning thyroid gland, but if their other organs are struggling, then they're already struggling to convert that T4 to T3. That's not going to flag if you just test TSH and T4. But when you actually look at how the body functions, that does show up as dysfunction. So that's issue number one. Then the active thyroid hormone has to be able to enter cells. And there are also certain things that can go wrong there, certain things that can impair its ability to actually bind to the cell or be transported to the cell. And then even to tell the thyroid gland that it needs to create T4, which is the building block, you rely on an impulse from the brain. And still other things can happen that kind of muffle that impulse. So high cortisol levels can muffle that impulse. I think even certain drugs like dopamine agonists can muffle that impulse. So when I talk about something that I talk about on my Substack is that hypothyroidism is endemic. It's probably a lot more common in people than we expect. But if we only look at T4 and if we only look at TSH, then all that we're looking at is, hey, how loud can our brain tell our thyroid gland to actually produce the hormone? And then we look at how much of the raw building block is our thyroid hormone producing. But those tests don't actually flag, is there maybe a problem with the brain being able to actually send the signal? Does low TSH mean no thyroid problem? Or does it mean the brain is actually struggling to tell the thyroid gland to make the hormone? And then we're also not spotting the conversion issues. For example, you can have normal T4, but maybe you have very low T3 if maybe you're undernourished or your liver is struggling, which funny enough, that was actually my issue. When I was going for tests, my TSH was elevated, mildly elevated, but it was still elevated. My T4 was normal, but my body temperature was 35 Celsius, 95 Fahrenheit, which is super low. And it wasn't until I was able to seek out better tests and actually check my T3 that I was like, oh, that's like bottom of the range. So like that conversion is not happening and that is not getting flagged. So that kind of covers the whole, I guess, thyroid issue. That's always a systemic issue. So even when I talk about hypothyroidism, I'm trying to almost find like a better way to phrase it, because that always gets associated with the gland itself. Like I'm trying to maybe call it a low thyroid hormone state or something else. I'm still working on the best phrasing that makes it clear. But it basically will affect every single system in the body when the active thyroid hormone levels are low, because then the rate at which you can make this energy is slow. And that usually shows up as symptoms. So your body temperature is lower than it normally would be, because as you're generating energy, as you're generating ATP, you're also generating heat. And if let's say your engines are running as they should, if the energy is being made at the rate at which it should be doing, then the heat that you offload should be enough to actually keep a normal body temperature, which in Celsius is 37, and in Fahrenheit, I think it's 98.6, but I might be wrong on that one because Fahrenheit does confuse me a little bit. So this is basically where the thyroid piece comes in and how it's so important to metabolism. Now, carbohydrates. Let's talk about that. And that's a big subject when it comes to thyroid health. So the most important piece is that the more carbohydrates that somebody eats, the higher their T3 levels tend to be. So already there's like almost a 1-to-1 relationship between more carbs means more active thyroid hormone. Now, why do carbs make you produce more of the active thyroid hormone? Well, there's a few different things that are kind of influencing that. One is that carbs are basically a signal that tells the body, hey, fuel, we're getting fuel. And the thyroid hormone, its main function is basically to accelerate fuel burning. So if you're having fuel coming in, that's good for the body. That tells the body that's safe to, burn the fuel, to put out more of the hormone that accelerates fuel burning. And the other reason why, and I mean, I guess it's kind of the same reason, but mechanistically, is when the body is not getting enough carbohydrates, it has to start relying on our stress system, specifically the hormone cortisol. Why that is, I can get into that in just a bit. And the issue with cortisol is that it can actually stop the conversion of our thyroid prohormone to the active thyroid hormone. And I would honestly expect that was something that was happening to me, because back when, I had so-called perfect thyroid labs, but I was cold, my hair was falling out, and I was tired and I couldn't sleep and I didn't have my menstrual cycle. I mean, that was also the time when I was under eating relative to how much I was training. And I was also kind of in this paleo brainwashing, I want to call it, where it's like, I wasn't like zero carb then, but I was still lower carb. It would be like have the fruit that isn't super sweet, have more protein. And yeah, that was basically not sending my body this fuel signal that would be supporting it and actually keeping the thyroid metabolism running at full throttle.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to talk more, I guess, about this like cortisol piece, and that when we are not fueling our bodies well with carbohydrate, our bodies, and I always say I was living off caffeine and cortisol.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know that at the time. And if you would have asked me at the time, I would have been like, I'm fine, I'm doing it, I'm going, look at me, I'm producing, I'm productive, I'm okay. But also I had so many underlying symptoms that I just had normalized because I hadn't found the help I needed my entire life of seeking it. So I was like, okay, this is just how it is and it's fine. Look at me, I'm producing, So yeah, tell me about why the body then needs to rely on cortisol if it's not getting enough sugar in the form of carbohydrate.
Yeah. So let's start with our brain. So we humans have massive brains. We're obviously a very smart animal. Let's call it that. We've built cities, we've built culture, all of that. And that brain needs a lot of energy. And our brain, something that a lot of people don't know about is that it's basically confined to running on glucose. So it's actually unable to fully switch onto running on fat. It always has to run on glucose. There are certain just peculiarities about how fats burn in mitochondria versus how carbs burn in mitochondria, where basically burning fats for energy makes it dangerous for the brain. So, I mean, ketones can be used partially in some parts of the brain, but basically most of the brain really relies on glucose, because glucose, in a sense, compared to other fuel sources, burns very clean. It produces the least amount of fumes. So now, why the cortisol? Well, the brain alone needs about 140 grams of glucose just for basic functions. Like, that's not even taking into account like you're studying or you're doing something that's very energy intensive, or you're learning new stuff, or I don't know, you're having a very deep conversation with someone or something else, right? Just like basic function, 140 grams of carbs. To get 140 grams of glucose from food, you need a pound of potatoes and 3 large oranges. Alone, just that. Well, what happens if you don't eat that many carbs? Well, the brain still needs to function. And thankfully, we have backup generators in the body to produce this glucose when you're not feeding your brain, which awesome, because otherwise we would die. But on the other hand, these backup generators run on our stress system. So if you go a little while without eating carbs, first there's a hormone that gets released called glucagon that tells your liver to start releasing some of its stored glucose to basically feed the brain, feed the nervous system. And then if you go longer without carbs or without enough carbs, such as if somebody is eating lower carb long term, like, I don't know, maybe only 100 or 50 grams of carbs a day, then your body starts using cortisol, its main stress hormone, to actually produce glucose out of proteins, whether it be the proteins that you eat, which is a messy ordeal for the body. It creates quite a lot of ammonia. It's very hard on the kidneys. So either out of the proteins that you eat, or it will start actually breaking down the proteins that make up your muscles, your skins, your organs, if it gets very bad. So basically, if you're not getting enough carbs, you are reliant on cortisol, because your brain, either way, your nervous system needs that glucose.
Oh, yeah, it actually still feels to me almost indulgent, the amount of carbs I now eat in a day, even though like my symptoms have gotten a lot better. I'm sleeping better, all sorts of, I've lost weight. I gained a bunch of weight when I was under eating and have only lost it since I've upped my calories and my carbs. But that's how like deeply ingrained in me, right? This idea that like eating carbs, eating sugar is bad for me, that I'm still like, I can't believe I'm eating this amount of rice right now, even though I've been doing that every day for years now. And I see this, man, it's almost like, I don't know if it's a punishment mindset, but it's certainly a like restrictive mindset around sugars and carbs that I see so many people have. And I see this applied to kids a lot through their parents, who are like, oh, no, I need to like pack them a super high protein lunch for school. And I just, oh, it's so hard to see that, because of course protein is important. I think a lot of people, and I don't know if this is true or not, I want to hear what you have to say, think of like protein and carbs kind of on a seesaw, that like you need to balance them out. And if you're going to have carbs, then you have to have a lot of protein at the same time, to ground the carbs, kind of, I think is how people feel it is. And especially with kids, but of course, also with adults, I'm like, no, that they need those carbs during their school day. They're expending so much physical energy playing, but also the mental energy of sitting in a chair and learning. So yeah.
Yeah. And having to pay attention and learn.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that like there's some truth to it, that I think it's best to, balance your meals. Like if you have a meal that has, let's say, some potatoes, a little bit of protein, bit of fat, like that's going to be more satiating. I feel like that actually does help with this blood sugar balance piece. However, I feel like that gets a little bit maybe misunderstood. We're thinking that you need to have so much protein, because otherwise you're going to have this massive blood glucose spike, and this spike is going to be bad for you. And I think that, that's a bit of a different, or I guess it's kind of a similar topic, but I think that this idea of blood sugar spikes is also a little bit misunderstood. I know that there's been a lot of hype on social media right now around like CGMs and these big spikes. And I know that it comes from some work that shows these massive like spikes after you have some carbs on its own. But I think what's important to remember is that if somebody is having a spike that big, that means that they already have some sort of a dysfunction. because the test that, like, even in pregnancy, you do the glucose tolerance test, right? Where you're being told to drink this massive, like, glass of, I think, like, pure, like, corn syrup or something crazy like this. And then your blood sugar is measured afterwards. And actually, if it spikes, that shows diabetes. That shows that you struggle with burning sugar. So if somebody shows that eating just like a potato or an orange gives them a massive spike, that already means that they have some sort of illness going on. And that should not be translated to a healthy, regular person, especially a child. I mean, a person that's having that big of a spike, they should probably be investigating, like, are they constantly running on cortisol? So are their cortisol levels very high all the time, because cortisol can actually block the action of insulin and can actually interfere with sugar burning. Are they do they even have like a pancreatic dysfunction where maybe they're not releasing insulin? That's why their sugar is staying in their blood so long. Like, basically, once there is a big spike, there's something wrong happening already in that person's body. It should not be applied to like an average healthy person. But yeah, no, I think that if a person is healthy, they should be even able to, drink a glass of orange juice, even maybe eat a potato on its own. And yeah, their blood sugar is going to increase afterwards, but it should not spike. So I think that, when you have, I think now this trend of always like, it's almost like treating the carbs as like, they're like a little treat that I can have if I have this big plate of protein, when that's actually the opposite of how it should be. Like, have some protein, because that's going to provide the structural components for your body. It's going to provide the amino acids for your liver to do the detoxification reactions. But then you also need the main fuel source, which is the carbohydrates. So
what if your healing didn't have to be done alone? What if togetherness was the medicine? You cook, clean, care, organize, soothe, fix, carry, and hold. When was the last time someone held you? My upcoming retreat in Costa Rica this November is not about escape. It's about remembering yourself in connection with other women and with the earth, with the water. We are going to be in hot springs, natural mineral hot springs. I was surprised when I shared about this in my Instagram stories recently, how many people have never experienced true earth and hot springs. I'm lucky to live in rural Northern California, where there are a few options around me, and it is the best experience, the best feeling. It's why I chose this specific itinerary for our trip in November 3rd through 8th, 2026, the Healing Waters Nature Immersion Retreat. You can learn all about it at the link below in the show notes. We would absolutely love to have you there. Yeah. And I think what you said about and this is what we do for ourselves and our daughter and her lunches, is both or all three, right? Fat, carbs, and proteins, but not being afraid of carbs, for ourselves and for our kids. And of course, it's so hard with kids because there are thousands of like really shitty processed food products and candies that are marketed to them that are on their level that of course they want. And so I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about like oatmeal, rice, potatoes, just like I feel like we're going to be unlearning carb fear for a really long time in our culture because of what happened with like keto and paleo in the 2010s and teens. It got so many of us.
Yeah, and that's also the scary thing about all of that, is that a lot of the people that come from that background, let's say low carb or keto, eating keto or low carb long term actually interferes with your ability to handle carbs. So if a person that's doing keto or very low carb, if they eat a bunch of carbs all of a sudden, then they measure their blood glucose, it's going to spike. And then they're going to basically like share that and be like, look what carbs did to me, right? And like the, I guess, average Joe, so to say, is going to look at that and be like, oh my God, carbs are so bad for me. But what we're not looking at is the context of this person that has been basically not allowing their body to have the carbs, constantly relying on the stress system, which actually muffles the calls of insulin, so to say, that interferes with the body's ability to burn sugar, that slows the metabolic rate. And then they just have a bunch of carbs and bad things happen. And it's interesting because actually in some of the keto community, it's known that if you're doing keto and then you have to go to the doctor for the glucose tolerance test, you actually have to slowly come out of ketosis and reintroduce carbs slowly up and up and up for about a week or two and then take the test. Because if you were to go straight from keto to taking the test, you would always flag as diabetic.
Wow. Okay. I'm curious then your take. I'm going to tell you some of my recent lab numbers because I think this is interesting and can speak more to all the things around blood sugar that are commonly misunderstood. So I had pretty high fasting insulin, 22, but my fasting glucose and is it A1C were normal. And, I've been eating like the percentage of carbs I am for years and years. So I know I'm not eating too many carbs. I know that my body's doing really well. My metabolic rate has gotten pretty high up. So I'm like, okay, why is the insulin so high? Well, thyroid function isn't great and ferritin is super low. And so what I am understanding from this is it's not that I'm eating too much sugar and that's spiking the insulin. It's that there's underlying cellular issues that are still happening there, with thyroid and ferritin being so low, which is going to affect thyroid, that my cells aren't uptaking the carbs as efficiently as I would like them to. And that's why the insulin is still high in the blood. It's not because I'm downing sugar.
So one thing that I also want to mention about insulin, because I think that it's there's the simplification where we talk that insulin helps you take up carbs or burn carbs, whereas insulin actually has a much more complicated role in the body. And the main way to describe what insulin does, I would say, is that it is used to shut down our backup generators. So when we're not eating carbs, if we go a very long time without carbohydrates, or if we're long-term eating low carb, then we rely on these higher glucagon and higher cortisol levels to basically produce sugar. So these hormones tell the liver to basically produce sugar, make your own sugar. They also tell body fat to release fat into the blood. So that's what I mean by backup generators. They're basically ways that the body has to supply fuel into the blood when there's not enough fuel coming in. Now, the issue when these hormones are very high is that they can actually muffle, so to say, the sound of insulin. So insulin normally tells the liver, hey, stop making your own sugar. We have sugar coming in. You don't have to work this hard anymore. And it also tells our fat cells to stop releasing so much fat into the blood. We don't need this anymore. Again, we have sugar coming in. And insulin, it doesn't actually push sugar into the cell the way that people think it does. We have, I think, 14 different receptors for that cells use to actually take up glucose. So the ones that are, I think it's the GLUT1 that's found mostly in the brain, that one's completely independent of insulin. It doesn't rely on insulin to take up glucose. And the one that's predominantly insulin dependent is the GLUT4, and that's mostly in muscle cells. And even then, insulin doesn't actually push glucose into muscles. It just tells muscles to express more of the receptors that take up glucose. So it's telling muscles hey, open more doors for glucose to go in. We can replenish muscle glycogen. We have sugar coming in. You're going to be nice and strong again. As to why insulin could be high, the cortisol piece, I think, would be probably what I would be suspecting, especially if, thyroid function is low. So the body keeps getting almost a single signal okay, we have to keep relying on cortisol. Our thyroid metabolism is suppressed a little bit. So I feel that is something that I would expect. And then with the low ferritin, I feel that maybe puts us towards the iron discussion a little bit, because iron, well, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. You don't want to have too much of it, and I can get into why that is for a reason. But at the same time, it is still an extremely important metal. We need it to actually be able to get oxygen into the cell, and oxygen is what actually accepts the fuel from food and then helps us make ATP. So we need we need iron to actually oxygenate our cells, and we need the oxygen in the cell for our oxidative metabolism for making energy. And then, and even, I don't want to say a more important piece, but another important function of iron is that it is actually needed for the formation of thyroid hormones in the thyroid gland. So I would maybe suspect that almost if ferritin is low, that could be happening in your case.
Yeah, that's kind of the conclusion I came to too. And okay, I want to get back to that, but first I want to say I didn't realize how rapidly changeable a lot of these lab numbers are, like that your TSH can be different day to day. And I wonder if that's insulin too, because I was stressed that morning. I was really stressed the morning I got the labs taken, and I'm fasting. And I had to drive somewhere and then try to get back for school drop off. I was like, could that, is insulin that changeable on a lab number? I wonder.
I think it could be. I mean, I'm not super well versed in lab numbers because I'm not a practitioner, so I don't see that many labs, right? I feel like there's one of the things that you maybe get more of a feel of when you see many labs. But very high cortisol levels can suppress TSH, for example. So it could be maybe that if TSH is showing up high or low, that could be a piece, but there could also be the piece that maybe the thyroid gland is actually struggling to create hormones. Maybe there's a problem there. That would also show that like the antibodies might then be high. That's basically showing that.
I did have high thyroid antibodies that morning too. The ferritin though, I've used Chronometer. I find it very hard to get enough iron through food. I'm still really figuring that out. It's been shocking to me that like and I get most of my daily RDAs through food, but iron, it's like it takes a lot more steak than you think, get that number. But so I've been supplementing with Floridix. Do you know what that is?
No, I don't.
I think it's Swedish company that's been around since it was invented in like the 1910s, and it is like iron ore taken from magnetite or hematite, and then combined with fermented glucose from grain, which like frees the iron. And then so it's in a liquid form, and then they add herbs like vitamin C rich herbs that help with absorption. Anyway, within a week, I was feeling so much better. And I was also, for that first week, I woke up at about 2 a.m. every night, super hungry. So my take on that, I'll run this by YouTube, is that like my metabolic rate increased enough that the glycogen, yes, the carb storage in my liver was running out. My liver was running out of that carb storage at 2 a.m. when it's doing a lot of work, and was like, hey, refuel real quick. And I'm so much hungrier in the last like 3 weeks since I've been, and moving my body a lot more and sleeping better.
Yeah. I think so. Iron, it's such a misunderstood topic, I think, because in like on social media in like the last few years, there's been this kind of movement of basically warning women like, hey, like your anemia might not be just iron deficiency. And here's the thing, I am happy about that movement on the one hand, because I think that if somebody has anemia, because anemia just basically means that you don't have enough hemoglobin, enough red blood cells. And there are many different nutrients that are used to make hemoglobin. You're using different B vitamins for that. You need vitamin E to make sure that the blood cells are not getting destroyed rapidly. Also, certain hormonal factors can suppress the bone marrow, like very high estrogen levels can suppress the bone marrow. Hypothyroidism can suppress the bone marrow. So then you're actually not making enough hemoglobin. So I think that this movement of basically warning against iron kind of came out of the whole anemia conversation, that, hey, if you have anemia, that doesn't necessarily mean low iron, especially because I think a lot of women have supplemented a lot of iron growing up. Like I even see this with like certain friends that are maybe not super health conscious, or even like family members where they're very anemic. I can tell that there's deeper issues going on. They barely eat. Their hands are always cold, but their doctor gives them iron. Their ferritin keeps climbing. They're not getting any better. And the thing with iron itself is that getting an excess of it is not benign in a sense, because it's a very reactive metal. That's actually why our blood uses it to carry oxygen, because it's kind of like an arcade claw machine. It can very quickly pick up and drop oxygen, pick up and drop oxygen. But when you have iron in its free form, like if it reacts with oxygen outside of the controlled environment that the body creates for it, it can generate these things called reactive oxygen species that can damage tissues and so on and so on. So I think that this conversation around, hey, let's make sure you're really iron deficient before you take iron, has been very important. However, I think that it has over time transformed into this conversation around like iron is just bad. And I don't know if maybe just a social media thing, because of course, like content on social media ends up being truncated and simplified because it's easier to get a message across that way. But I have seen almost like a swing towards, I think, a lot of women developing an iron deficiency by kind of maybe, I don't want to say taking that message too seriously, but maybe not seeing whether that message applies to them. Like I will say myself, I've done many things in the past where I actually felt like I was quite iron overloaded. My ferritin was almost in the 300s. My hemoglobin was high. I don't know what my transferrin saturation was because that's an important test to actually tell what's happening. But that was also during a time where I was eating no dairy, a lot of red meat, and I lost my menstrual cycle. So it makes sense that I'd be accumulating iron. And actually, when I started having my menstrual cycle again, especially when it was heavy at the start, when I would be losing a lot of blood, I felt so much better. So I was like, okay, I'm the target audience for the message of too much iron can be bad for you, because I was clearly somebody that was iron overloaded at one time. But then I think this year, for the first time, I started feeling a little bit iron deficient, where I myself started seeking out foods that are like a little bit, we have like this drink here in Germany that it's like a fruit juice that has iron in it, that now I will drink it after my menstrual cycle and I feel better. So I was like, oh, this is what a real iron deficiency feels like. And I feel like this is the first time I've had it in my life. And the thing about iron is that, again, you don't want too much of it because it can increase oxidative stress in the body. However, it is so important because different mitochondrial complexes actually use iron to function. So that means that your cellular machinery actually uses iron as like a component in it to actually run the machine, keep the machine running. You need iron to actually get oxygen into the cell, and you need it to make thyroid hormones. And one, I guess, interesting thing with the antibodies that you mentioned is that there's actually a link between iron deficiency, like true iron deficiency, not anemia, but true iron deficiency, and having higher thyroid antibodies. And one reason for that might be that the TPO protein, the TPO enzyme that actually helps the body create thyroid hormones, it has iron in its structure. And if iron is missing, that TPO enzyme can become like misfolded. Like it basically, it's not built right. So then it might be that what we basically see as like, hey, the body is attacking itself, it's destroying this protein. Maybe it's not attacking itself, but maybe it is getting rid of this protein because it's not built right. So that would maybe actually make a link with this low iron piece.
Yeah. So TPO is thyroid peroxidase.
Yeah. And anti-TPO is the antibody that usually flags.
Yes. We are not going to get into Hashimoto's, but I want people to know that you have an entire article about that on your Substack that explains this better and is really interesting and is sort of a different view on autoimmunity in general.
Yeah, it is like a bit of I want to call it a bit of a hypothesis paper, but then again, what isn't a hypothesis in science? We're constantly learning new things. But it's looking at this idea that when we're thinking that like the body is attacking the thyroid, maybe the reason why it's, attacking, so to say, this enzyme that helps us make thyroid hormones isn't because the body's confused and wants to destroy it just because, but maybe because there's actually so much oxidative stress happening in the body that if the thyroid gland was to keep creating hormones, that would destroy it. Or maybe that protein is not built correctly because there's some cofactor missing. And the body, what we basically think of as attacking itself, is the body just cleaning up things that are already broken.
Yeah, it's intriguing. I'm curious to see like how the science, plays out on that over time. And yes, there is very much a school of thought that is loud on social media that everyone is iron toxic, that everyone has too much iron. and that you should bloodlet basically to get
Yeah.
rid of it.
Yeah.
And I think iron, almost more than any other piece, is just like the one that you need to know your actual bio-individual picture on before you take any action, because it's very complex. Iron metabolism is super complex, and you don't want to be too low and you don't want to be too high. So just finding out where you're specifically at. Like, I'm not anemic. All my other iron markers were fine. It's just the low ferritin. And that's a different picture than someone who is showing anemia. And it's all so complicated.
Yeah. And I think that the sign that, it's working for you is that you are feeling better with the iron, that it is actually fixing your symptoms. It's not like the case where somebody is anemic and then they take iron and it's not doing anything. In that case, then it's like, okay, then it's probably not iron that's your missing piece. You probably maybe even have more than enough iron, or maybe you have enough, who knows? But something else is missing, maybe even to absorb this iron or to handle it, or maybe you actually have already too much of it in your cells, in your tissues, and you're missing something else needed to make hemoglobin. So yeah, it's a super complex topic, but I think that with iron, it's one of those nutrients where I feel like it is important to actually get blood work done to, like you said, test your ferritin, transferrin saturation, maybe even test like inflammatory markers to see maybe like there's some sort of inflammation that's actually stopping the body from absorbing iron, even if you're eating enough of it. So yeah, I think that with many other nutrients, symptoms I think are very important to track and kind of have an idea of like what symptoms correlate with which deficiency. But I think that chronometer, just like as a tracking tool to like put in like what you ate and basically look at it like, okay, so Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I did not get enough magnesium through diet. So if you look at that, you can be like, okay, I probably need more magnesium. So I think that can be a helpful tool otherwise. But yeah, with iron, I think the tests are just really important.
Yeah. Before we jump over to Patreon, I wanted to go back because you really helped me understand this one thing that I think kind of ties this all back into what we talked about at the beginning, which is, a high metabolic rate is as upstream as it gets. And that's what, sort of like can fix all your downstream problems that you've been trying to get to through all these different ways for all this time. And you wonder why you're not getting better. Your great article on sleep, you talk about how you need a high metabolic rate you need energy to sleep. And this feels unintuitive to a lot of people. Like, well, when I just sleep well, if I'm in a low energy state, but that is not what happens.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, so much repair happens during sleep, and there's something that I can't tell I can't remember if this comes from Dr. Ray Peat or if this comes from Albert St. George or maybe Gilbert Ling, but this idea of a resting state, that the resting state of the cell is actually like a highly energized state. Like you need to have a lot of energy to basically be able to calm down, to get your stress system down, to kind of keep like the coherence in the body and be able to fall asleep. Like I think that, again, a lot of people think that like if they're feeling super like agitated, I would say, like, you can't stop bouncing your leg, your mind keeps like running in these different directions, that means that you have a lot of energy. But that is almost like, I don't know, like a circuit board that's like short circuiting because it's not able to actually send the signal all the way. So it's like getting stuck and it's like buzzing out. Like you actually need to be able to create enough energy to fully be able to calm the body down and repair and sleep deeply. And, like you said, also with liver glycogen, to store enough sugar in your liver to be able to release that during sleep, to be able to actually maintain your blood sugar. So, yeah.
Yeah. So it's so interesting. You need energy to be in a coherent enough state to deeply rest.
Yeah. And I think that that's the word that kind of sums up all of it, is coherence. Like you need energy to keep the body coherent. And I mean, I'm not going to get into this because I'm not going to pretend like I understand it, but it's the work of Dr. Gilbert Ling. It's super out there, it's super complicated. And I hope that one day I'll be smart enough to fully get it. But he talks about ATP, the energy molecule, actually being the molecule that actually helps structure water in the body to actually keep the coherence, so that it's not just an energy packet, that's actually something that the body uses to keep the system coherent, to basically manage minerals inside the cell, outside the cell, to make sure that you have potassium in the cell, that you have sodium in the body, sodium in the blood. So yeah, I think that coherence is really the word that this really boils down to.
Yep. I just, I'm so wary of different, because of the 25 years I jumped from like health framework to health framework to health framework, diet to diet to diet, always looking to optimize my health. Always. When I used the word diet, I wasn't trying to lose weight, because I was never overweight until a few years ago when I completely crashed. But so it's been 3 or 4 years now that I've been really studying, looking into this bioenergetic view, the repeat, the pro-metabolic. And I'm like, yeah, I haven't seen anything yet that makes me think this isn't the most helpful and like true to cellular biology framework that there is. And because it's just that, it's just cellular metabolism. How well is your body taking fuel and turning it into energy? Like, it doesn't get any simpler or any more upstream than that.
Yeah. And I mean, as someone where I basically, I guess, make a living right now by reading a bunch of research papers every day, it's so amazing to me, because the more you read, the more this idea is validated. Like, you look at different disease states, and like that's the unifying principle, is that there's an energy failure in every disease state. Like I said, you look at heart failure, and you basically see that the heart is losing its ability to make energy, whether out of glucose or fat, like that's just falling apart. You look at Alzheimer's disease, you see that there's this energy failure in the brain. You look at liver disease, there's an energy failure happening there. You look at anything, like you actually go into the medical literature and you read about any disease, and it eventually boils down to you have an energetic failure in the organ, in the system. And then it's always like certain things that support this energy metabolism that are shown to help, whether it be vitamin B1, which helps your cells burn glucose, whether it be magnesium, which also helps your body burn glucose, whether it be the other B vitamins that are used to burn both glucose and fat, whether it be anything that increases thyroid hormone levels, be it something like selenium or even thyroid hormone supplementation. Like, it just boils down to that. Basically, you go deep enough into the issue with any system and you basically just arrive at that. So I feel the same way as you. I mean, I'm also I'm very skeptical myself. I think that that's why I love reading the research so much, because I'm like, I feel like I've been misled by so many of these schools of thought. And like, yeah, it's very complicated, and especially because all of it uses like science ease, like it's not written for a regular person. Like, it's almost like learning a new language, trying to decipher what these studies say. So that itself is energy intensive. But yeah, like I always like to question my preconceived notions too. Like, I want to make sure that I want to make sure what I'm putting out into the world, that I'm not another voice misleading people, right? Because there's already a lot of that. And I don't think that there's bad intentions. I just think that these topics are just so complex. But that's like the one unifying principle. The more that I read about things, like my views maybe change based on okay, maybe I misunderstood this specific mechanism. Maybe now I have another piece that I can add and the puzzle makes a lot more sense. But those are like the details. But there's nothing that has come into my field of view yet. And I mean, again, now for 4 years, I've basically been reading research for a living. There's nothing that I've come across yet that would make me think that this premise that energy is the unifying concept is wrong.
Yeah, I want to actually really heavily plug your Substack right now, because
Thank you.
I'm rereading your the titles here, and just everyone could benefit from one of these. And I want to say too, you're not just presenting the research, you are also giving actionable steps, and you often do it in phases. First phase, do the 3 basic things. If you still are struggling after a while, then phase 2, do these 3 basic things. So you're not trying to overwhelm people, and you're not trying to throw too many inputs at people at once. You thought really carefully about okay, what is the most important thing to do here? So not only is there the overviewing like lens of how to look at this issue, but then there's the research that, again, you have all the links below, and then there's the practical advice. So there's like how to finally heal your gut, why kids are going through puberty earlier now, how to heal MCAS and histamine intolerance, how the carnivore diet can worsen your oxalate problem, how to not get fat on the quote pro-metabolic diet, one of my favorites, followed up with how to lose fat without ruining your metabolism. Right now, you're doing a series called How to Spot Vitamin Deficiencies Based on Your Symptoms. That's really incredible.
That's my favorite. There's so much like a very old research that's been buried on that. And I did vitamin B5 recently, and it was just so fascinating because there's not a lot of like new research on it, because it's like the name of the vitamin implies like it's found everywhere. It's like pantothenic acid, like pantos, like everywhere. But then I stumbled upon research from like the 1940s that's like, oh, wait, maybe it is in every food, but it's destroyed easily. And look at all this research back then that was actually treating things with this vitamin. So yeah, that's one of my favorite series because it gets me to dig into very old stuff, which is usually like, I feel like scientists used to be actually a lot more curious back in the day. So it's a lot more fun to read.
Definitely. My ferritin is low. Should I supplement iron? How to finally heal your gut, etc. And then also people will love this. I love this. I'm one of those people who lives for this stuff. What I eat in a day, metabolism boosting, summer meal plans. It's just like, it's very practical again. So, okay, let's jump over to Patreon and talk a little more about, quote, the pro-metabolic diet.
Let's do it.
What we see, influencers getting the vast chasm between the actual research and the actual coherent framework of upping your metabolic rate and, quote, the pro-metabolic diet as presented by influencers, because they can be very different and it's confusing a lot of people and it's really hard to watch.
Yeah.
Okay. Fundamental Nourishment is the Substack. Thank you so much, Kai. So happy to meet you and to get to learn.
It was incredible meeting you. Thank you for having me on.
Okay, so head over to the Medicine Stories Patreon page to hear our extended conversation about what pro-metabolic influencers get wrong. We talk about who Dr. Ray Peat actually was, what he actually said and did. And again, Kaya gives her very most basic suggestions for starting to eat a more micronutrient-dense diet.
His articles don't provide like a list of foods. It's not a meal plan. So it makes sense that, like what you said, people would kind of like look at maybe foods that he has mentioned throughout his different interviews and basically made like a protocol out of it. Like, okay, Dr. Ray Peat mentioned milk. That means everyone has to drink milk. Or Dr. Ray Peat has mentioned orange juice. That means that everybody has to drink orange juice.
What I hear from so many women is, I can't afford to eat pro-metabolic. And I'm like, that's because that's what the influencers are making you think is what this diet is. Yeah, crazy, because that's like such an antithesis to what he stood for. I mean, again, I'm speaking for somebody who I never met, and he passed away, and I just read his work. But that's kind of like what I gathered on his general worldview from his work. So it wasn't just all about optimizing metabolism, biohacking. It was more so about like, hey, we are not being given the best information as a society. Even those of us who are struggling deserve better. I think that long-term, the goal should always be to try and tolerate as many foods as possible. But I think sum up how I've seen the pro-metabolic space evolve on Instagram, it's almost like you are recommending foods that you can only unlock once you reach level 10 of the game, but you're still on level 1. And she's got all those amazing meal plans at her Substack. Really, really, really appreciate them, because, I just see people online like, okay, great, but how do I do this? So that's one way in if you're the type of person who likes, really specific guidance. They're like pretty. She has infographics and, or maybe not infographics, but graphics, just graphics next to the recipes and the shopping lists. And she breaks down the micronutrients and macronutrients. So I've actually never seen anyone do it as thoroughly as she does, and I really appreciate it. after we recorded this, I was thinking I had a histamine flare like that week. And if you watched on Patreon my previous video call that I put up there with Sina, recent guest, Sina Maria, where she interprets my blood labs and HTMA. And she, within a few minutes of that call, was like, Amber, you have like histamine intolerance issues in the gut. And she's absolutely right. I do. And I just had not had that framing yet. I, was aware of it. Just, there's just so much to think about, especially if you've been unwell and you're recovering your health. And I've gotten better in a lot of ways. And this histamine issue, I think, is sort of maybe like the final piece to get to. So anyway, I was like, I bet Kaya has an article on histamine, and she sure does. It's like healing MCAS, mast cell activation, is it syndrome, and histamine. And I'm only about halfway through it right now, but I already understand it so much better than I did before. My research on the internet, even listening to podcasts and everything over the last couple of weeks, I've gotten some understanding, but Kaya's article just immediately breaks it down and makes it so much easier. And I can't wait to get farther to the end where she gives the steps on how to heal. And, if I was in a much worse place where I was reacting all the time, I'd probably skip the explanatory parts and get right to the steps. So I just appreciate her so much for what she has out there. There's so many more articles than the ones that I read off to at the end of our interview. There's just so much there. So the link to the Patreon and to her Substack are in the show notes, as always. If you don't know where show notes are, this is a question I actually get quite a bit. Wherever you pushed play on this podcast, just scroll down a little bit and there'll be a description of the episode and then links beneath that. There will also be the link to our online herbal medicine shop, mythicmedicine.shop. Thank you so much for supporting our small family business. While you're there, either take the quiz or just scroll to the bottom of the home screen and sign up for our newsletter so you can know when we run sales. We just had a big sale, and if you're not on the newsletter, you're not going to hear about it. And also the Costa Rica trip, the Healing Waters Nature Immersion. Oh, I can't wait. Happening in November. There are still spots left. Not going to do the one spot left thing because there are more than one spot left, but it's also more than 2/3 full. I think August is the last date to sign up. So we'll see where we're at when the time comes. And I would just really love to see you there. So all the links are in the show notes. I'll see you next time. I'm going to be interviewing Ashley Wilkin again in the next episode. We are going to answer some of the most frequently asked questions that we got following that episode. Okay, looking forward to it.